Tonight, investigators continue to pore over these writings the El Paso shooter apparently posted minutes before the deadly rampage. The document, clearly anti-immigration, anti-government. We should note it also criticizes both Democrats and Republicans. And while the writer claims that the views were formed before Donald Trump was elected president, the New York Times reports that it does match some of Trump's language, as well as the recurring language that we hear in politics of a, quote, immigrant invasion.
Deport criminal aliens and keep the coyotes and traffickers and drug dealers the hell out of our country, please. But how do you stop these people? You can't. There's no... That's only in the panhandle you can get away with that statement. Only in the panhandle. You look at what's marching up, that's an invasion. That's an invasion. It is an invasion, you know that. I say invasion, they say, isn't that terrible? I don't care what the fake media says, that's an invasion of our country.
This morning, President Trump condemned in a scripted speech what he called racism and white supremacy. He made no mention of his own rhetoric that you just heard, race baiting, invasion, etc. It comes at a time, though, when experts say that the number of hate groups is growing from 784 documented in 2014 to over 1,000 nowadays. And I'm joined by Heidi Barrick, an expert on extremism and white supremacy from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which monitors domestic hate groups, and Jason Johnson, politics editor for The Root. Heidi, how much does what we observed and what's been documented in the murders over the weekend fit in with these larger patterns and the rhetoric we just heard on screen? How much does that fit in your view?
Well, unfortunately, Trump's rhetoric of invasions, his other comments about Mexicans as rapists, etc., is speaking directly to what white supremacists want to hear. They have responded enthusiastically to this presidency. They've imbibed these ideas. And, you know, at this point, the country has more hate groups, 1,020, than the Southern Poverty Law Center has ever counted. And this just shows how this kind of rhetoric is fueling this extremism in our nation.
Jason, building on that point, the president obviously hit some sort of new approach, emphasis, or message today. And people can assess for themselves, as we've pointed out, how it contradicts what he's said before and whether it's genuine or not. Here is how he used to describe his view of whether this white nationalism, as documented, was an actual problem in the United States. Take a look.
You see today white nationalism as a rising threat around the world.
I don't really. I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. I guess if you look at what happened in New Zealand, perhaps that's a case. I don't know enough about it yet. They're just learning about the person and the people involved. But it's certainly a terrible thing.
Jason?
Yeah, it's typical word salad from President Trump. Look, we already know who he is, Ari. We know that he is a terrorist sympathizer, that he has encouraged and not changed his dialogue and his rhetoric at all that encourages these groups. We've got reports coming out of the Washington Post and New York Times today saying that FBI agents feel hamstrung to go into these kinds of investigations because they believe that this might be Trump's base and they're going to be in trouble. The president has pulled back funding from investigating these kinds of groups. And something else I want to point out here, there's a bill sitting in the Senate right now, Senate Bill 894. It's been signed by Sanders and Booker and Klobuchar and Harris that is supposed to approach domestic terrorism, specifically targeting white nationalists. And it hasn't moved at all. And Mitch McConnell hasn't moved it. And the president hasn't moved it. And Senator Gillibrand hasn't even signed on to it yet. There are methods at our disposal that we can use to address these issues. The president has done nothing practical in any shape or form, either rhetoric or policy-wise, to address this rising terrorism threat that is a danger to white people as much as anybody else in this country.
And Heidi, do you think that the nation has a decent literacy on this? The stats that we mentioned are the FBI saying the majority of these types of arrests are linked to white nationalism, which is to say, at least with regard to suspects, and we can always note legally being a suspect doesn't mean you did anything yet or you've been convicted, but as far as the threat that they're tracking is, it's not other types of domestic crime, it's not these other extremists. ISIS is a huge problem internationally, but the numbers show that it's majority white supremacy-linked suspects. Do you think we have the right literacy on that or not yet?
I don't think the country does have the right literacy on that. For so long, terrorism has been framed as something coming from the Middle East, from ISIS, from Al-Qaeda. But the fact of the matter is the number of domestic terrorist attacks where white supremacists are accused of fomenting the violence has been on the rise. And in 2018, every one of those domestic terrorist attacks was committed by someone who's connected to some of these racial ideologies. So this problem is on the rise, and the kind of thing that most people think about when they think of terrorism, which is Islamic extremism, is actually on the decline, at least if you look at the number of attacks. And people don't connect the dots here, right? Every time there's an attack of some sort by an extremist Muslim, the idea is that these are all connected. But when an incident happens like happened in El Paso, or the attack on the MAX train in Portland a couple of years ago, or Dylan Roof's attack in Charleston, they're seen as one-offs, when in fact they also are a pattern. They're connected by the ideology of white supremacy.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.